Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It happened one cold, foggy evening in a small town just outside of Portland. The town was famous for its eerie, historic buildings and dark forests that surrounded it like a thick wall of shadows. This was a place where people rarely ventured out after dusk, and there were rumors, unsettling, whispered rumors about the old mansion on the hill. Everyone knew about the mansion. It had stood abandoned for decades, its windows like hollow eyes watching over the town. Most people didn't dare go near it, but one group of college friends, all eager to prove their bravery, decided to explore it one Halloween night. They arrived at the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep purple. The fog had rolled in from the woods, and the air was thick with a damp chill. The gate creaked ominously as they pushed it open, the sound reverberating in the still night. Their flashlights flickered nervously as they walked up the overgrown path to the door, feeling an unsettling weight in the air. They pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The smell of decay was overpowering, mixed with the faintest hint of something else, something sweet like rotting flowers. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper and dust covered every surface. As they moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaned under their weight, as if the house itself were alive, protesting their intrusion. One of the friends, Sarah, felt a strange sensation, a tingling, almost electric, that crept up her spine. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the hall behind them was empty. She shook her head, attributing it to the cold air and the adrenaline of exploring the abandoned mansion. They made their way upstairs, where the air grew colder and the silence more oppressive. As they entered the master bedroom, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath became visible, swirling in the dim light of their flashlights. It was then that they heard it, the soft sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The group froze, their eyes darting nervously toward each other. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. But the others were too scared to speak. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though someone or something was walking toward them from the darkness. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath their feet cracked loudly, as if something heavy had just moved directly beneath them. A thick, suffocating silence followed. The air seemed to press against their skin, and they could feel the weight of something malevolent watching them. The temperature plummeted further, and the lights of their flashlights flickered uncontrollably. "Get out!" someone screamed, and in that moment, the group bolted down the stairs, scrambling for the exit. But as they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. Panic set in, and they tried desperately to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. They could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of breathing, ragged and heavy, coming from the darkness just beyond their reach. One of the friends, Dave, turned to look behind him. His flashlight landed on something that made his blood run cold. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, pale, gaunt, its face twisted in agony. It had no eyes, only empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth moved soundlessly, as though whispering something incomprehensible. "Run!" Dave yelled, and they all tore away from the door, heading for a window. But before they could even make it halfway, the figure was upon them. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness swallowed her was the creature's long, bony hand reaching out toward her. The next morning, the mansion was quiet again. No one knew what happened to the group of friends, but the townspeople whispered about strange happenings, about noises in the night that could never be explained. And the mansion on the hill? It still stands, its windows watching, waiting. Sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and low, people claim to see shapes moving behind the glass. But no one dares go near it anymore.
Story number 2.
This one took place at a remote summer camp in the mountains, where a group of college students had decided to volunteer as camp counselors for a few weeks. The camp had always been known for its peaceful, rustic charm, but there was something unsettling about it that none of them could quite explain. It wasn't until the middle of their first week there that things began to take a darker turn. The camp was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization, and the counselors were told not to wander too far from the campgrounds. They were supposed to be watching over the kids, keeping them entertained and safe. But it wasn't the kids that were causing the counselors to feel uneasy. It was the strange, unexplained events that began happening after dark. It started with small things. A counselor would return to their cabin to find a light on that had been off when they left, or a window that had been cracked open, even though they were sure they'd closed it before leaving. One night, Sarah, one of the counselors, went to check on the kids who were staying in the furthest cabin, a 10-minute walk from the main camp. When she got there, everything seemed fine, until she noticed something strange. One of the children's blankets had been folded into a neat pile on the floor, though the child hadn't moved from their bed. She brushed it off as a mistake, thinking maybe one of the kids had done it themselves. But as she was walking back to the main camp, she felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched. A cold wind swept through the trees, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. She turned around, half expecting to see someone following her, but there was nothing, just the eerie quiet of the woods. The next night, things escalated. The counselors were gathered around the campfire after the kids had gone to bed, telling ghost stories and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over them. That was when one of them, Jack, mentioned hearing odd noises coming from the woods during the night. He said he had heard what sounded like whispering, like voices on the wind, but when he tried to listen closer, there was nothing. Later that night, as Sarah was returning to her cabin, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. There was something wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. She noticed something else, too. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves had stopped entirely. She quickly hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Around midnight, the screaming started. At first, it was faint, almost like the wind carrying distant shouts. But then it grew louder, unmistakable, high-pitched, frantic, and filled with terror. The other counselors awoke and rushed out of their cabins to see what was happening. The source of the screaming seemed to be coming from deep within the woods, far beyond the campfire's light. They hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or call the authorities. The sound was so terrifying, so unnatural, that none of them dared venture toward it. The screaming stopped abruptly, only to be replaced by something far worse. A soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging through the dirt, came from the woods. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was silent. They tried to go back to sleep, but none of them could. It was hours before dawn when they heard a knock at one of the counselors' doors. The door creaked open slowly, and standing in the doorway was one of the children. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "I heard someone calling my name from the woods," he whispered. "It said it was my mom." The counselors were shaken to their core. They quickly gathered the children together and began to pack up, preparing to leave the camp early. But as they were about to load up the cars, one of the counselors, Emily, screamed. She was pointing toward the woods, her fingers shaking. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a figure, tall, pale, and gaunt, with long outstretched arms. Its face was featureless, a smooth skin-colored mask of blankness. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching them. Suddenly, the figure blinked, or at least it seemed to. The counselors could have sworn they saw its eyes, wide and dark, appearing for just a moment before disappearing back into the empty, smooth face. The air around them seemed to freeze. No one dared move, frozen by the sight of it. In an instant, the figure vanished into the trees, leaving only the thick silence behind. Without a word, the counselors grabbed the kids and ran to the cars. They didn't stop until they were miles away, the camp vanishing in the rearview mirror. None of them ever spoke about what happened at the camp again. They finished their time as counselors in silence, and when the session was over, they left without ever looking back. But every year, when the wind picks up just right and the trees whisper through the night, they can't help but wonder if something is still out there in those woods, waiting for its next victims. And every so often, one of them swears they hear a faint whisper, carried by the wind, calling their name.
Story number 3.
This next one is about a seemingly innocent road trip that turned into a nightmarish experience for a young couple. Emily and Ben had been together for about a year when they decided to take a road trip across the country. They were both adventurous, eager to explore new places, and the idea of getting away from their busy lives in the city sounded like the perfect escape. They packed up their car and set out on a journey that would take them through forests, small towns, and desolate stretches of highway. One evening, after a long day of driving, they found themselves in a remote area in the middle of nowhere. They had been following the main highway, but it began to get dark, and there were no signs of civilization for miles. Ben, always the optimist, suggested they keep going until they found a small town to stay in for the night. Emily, however, began to feel uneasy. There was something about the darkness of the road ahead, the sense of isolation, that was starting to get to her. As they continued driving, they noticed a small, dimly lit sign by the side of the road that read, "Welcome to Ridge Hollow." The town was tucked away behind a thick wall of trees, but the lights glowing in the distance suggested it was a place where they could find food and a place to sleep for the night. Relieved, they made a sharp turn off the highway and drove toward the town. Ridge Hollow looked charming at first. A few scattered houses, a small general store, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. But as they drove deeper into the town, Emily noticed something odd. The streets were completely empty. There wasn't a single person around. The silence was deafening, and the only sounds were their car tires crunching over the gravel road. Ben was already planning where they would stay, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They stopped by the diner, hoping to ask about nearby motels, but when they went inside, the door creaked loudly and no one greeted them. The diner was dimly lit with empty booths and tables as if it had been abandoned long ago. Behind the counter, an old man was hunched over, his back turned to them as he wiped down the counter in slow, methodical motions. Emily shivered and tried to get Ben's attention, but he seemed too comfortable, as if everything was fine. She walked over to the counter and asked the man if they could find a place to stay for the night. The old man didn't look up, but he responded in a raspy, low voice. "There's a motel down the road. Just keep going straight. Can't miss it." Ben thanked the man and led Emily out of the diner, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in around them. They found the motel just as the old man had said. It was small, with a neon light flickering outside the door, but there was no one at the front desk when they walked in. They called out, but no one answered. After a moment, a door opened at the back of the lobby, and a woman appeared. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and her smile was unnervingly wide. "Room for two?" she asked in a sing-song voice. Ben nodded, and the woman handed them a key, her fingers cold against their skin. Emily hesitated for a moment, but Ben was already leading her toward the room. As they entered, the faint smell of mildew hit them, and the lights flickered briefly before they steadied. Emily's nerves were on edge, but she tried to shake off the feeling of unease. After all, they had just driven hours to get to this point. She had to remind herself it was all in her head. They unpacked their things, but as they did, they noticed something strange. The room felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. Ben suggested they go for a walk to clear their heads, but when they stepped outside, the entire town seemed even more desolate. The silence was unnerving, and the air felt heavier than it had earlier. They walked for a while, hoping to shake the feeling, but it only seemed to intensify. As they neared the edge of town, Emily heard the sound of soft footsteps behind them. She turned, expecting to see another person, but no one was there. Only the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. They quickly returned to the motel, but as they approached their room, they saw something that froze them in their tracks. The door was wide open. Neither of them had left it like that, and as they stepped inside, everything was exactly as they had left it, except for one thing. In the middle of the bed was a single red rose. Neither of them remembered seeing the flower when they left. It hadn't been there when they unpacked. And yet, there it was, sitting perfectly in the center of the bed, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The air grew cold again, and Emily felt her stomach twist into knots. She turned to Ben, but he was already moving toward the window, looking outside. "I think we should leave," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But when she turned around to face the door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the hallway, staring at them with dark, hollow eyes, was the woman from the front desk. Her smile never faltered. Without another word, Ben grabbed her hand, and they bolted from the room. As they ran down the hall, they could hear the soft, deliberate footsteps of someone following them. They didn't stop until they were back in the car, speeding away from the town as fast as they could. The next day, as they passed through the area, they noticed the road sign for Ridge Hollow had disappeared. No sign of the town was anywhere. The highway stretched ahead of them, the sun finally breaking through the clouds. But the memory of Ridge Hollow stayed with them, haunting them long after the road trip ended. To this day, neither of them have spoken of what happened that night, and they never returned to that stretch of highway.